Hello and welcome to another MarketMuse content strategy webinar. And today we've got some amazing guests and we have an awesome topic, how to crush SEO content without being a copycat. Before I intro him, I'm gonna give you a little bit of housekeeping. If you've got any questions and answers, we've got a guest that has done it all from in-house as a consultant, worked with large businesses, worked with small ones, worked with companies just focused on growth, worked with ones just trying to get stuff done. Please ask them in the side and we'll get to them if they're in line, if they're relevant, or we'll get them at the tail end in our Q&A section. Another piece of housekeeping, check out the recording. It'll be sent out in the next couple days. But while you're there, go check out, I think we've got about 50 content strategy webinar recordings that are accessible. If you download a couple of them, shoot me a note at jeff@marketmuse.com and I'll set up a content strategy advisory session with our team. All right, so I am going to intro our guest. He is a special guest. He's going to get into some more about his background, but he's really done it all. And I'll give you a fun fact of last time we hung out in person was at a conference and we were set up, I believe my guest or my teammate was Michael Brenner, and I believe yours was, it's kind of escaping me, Andrea Fryrear, and we played Super Password and you killed us. And that podcast episode never aired. But it's great to talk to you, Eli.
I had that picture on my fridge.
What did you say?
There was a good picture of it. I remember having it on my fridge.
I had it on my desk forever. I was like, oh, that is just an awesome picture. And I don't believe that ever aired. But yeah, so if for people that might not know you, Eli, tell us a little bit about your background and what you're currently focused on and what you're currently excited about.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Jeff. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad we made it happen. So I spent about 12 years as an in-house SEO, and while I was working in-house, I worked for some startups, and I spent the last role I had was at SurveyMonkey as director of growth and leading the SEO team. And while I was working there, and while I was working on these roles, I had some interesting experiences helping some startups and even some larger businesses really figure out their in-house challenges, and made me realize that there could be a lot more fun I could be having, a lot more impact I'd be having by working with a lot of different companies and helping them solve their in-house SEO challenges. And that's what I've been doing about the last year and a half. So working with some really interesting companies, big and small, helping them to build out products for SEO. And it's not just around like content and copying your competitors, as we're going to talk about today, but really building something useful for users and how to grow SEO as a channel and not just grow SEO as a piece of content or some rankings. And the more and more companies I work with, the more I see that everyone's challenge is the exact same. It's really getting it done, convincing the boss to pay for it, getting the right users, measuring it, looking better than the other team that maybe has some bigger budgets. And I'm having a lot of fun doing it, as I thought I would, and really meeting cool people. So this is SEO, I think is only going to continue to grow. And I love when people say SEO is dead, because that's fine. You don't have to do SEO. We'll do it. So really looking forward into digging into this today and like how to make things happen and how to really grow SEO without being boring.
No, that's awesome comment, and I'm sure we'll see there will be questions and answers about that. But just being someone who was in the in-house role for 15 years myself, and we building internal offerings, having to get those things prioritized, and we're so connected, and I look forward to this discussion. To start along the lines of what we were going to talk about today with building content that's differentiated, not focusing only on being a copycat, really wanted to begin by getting your sense. There's so much noise, whether you're on LinkedIn, whether you're on Twitter, whether you're on SEO Twitter, which is its own world, about content quality, about EAT. How do you think about content quality and differentiation? And how do you think about how, frankly, how Google's managed it over the years, and how what you recommend and what you advise on has changed, or how it's become like a, hey, I told you so this whole time situation, as I kind of get that sense from you. But let's, how do you think about content quality right now when you're giving advice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had a unique advantage, and I just moved to Houston from the Bay Area. So I'm one of those, right? Cliche. I moved from California to Texas. But I spent many years in the Bay Area, and I lived in Palo Alto, right near Google's headquarters. And about 4 to 5 times a day, I would see a Waymo car, which is Google's self-driving car. So Google's been doing these things for about 10 years. And, you know, a few years ago, I had this realization when someone was pitching me these shady links. I was like, Google's got these cars on the road. They've driven more miles. I think they've driven 9 billion miles. Someone correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. More miles than anybody else. And they haven't killed anybody that we heard of, right? They Uber hit someone, right? But Google has never made the media for doing something really bad. Now that's AI. And this is the company that they do a lot of things, right? We have all Gmail accounts and they do search, but they're putting AI into all this. So a company that's good enough to do that level of AI, and really what AI is, it's intelligence. It's artificial intelligence trying to be exactly like a human. So Google's trying to achieve that level of intelligence. Now, when I think about content quality, I think about us as humans, and I'm gonna connect the two dots right here. Think about us as humans, like we're reading content, and you know right away that that content is of quality or of not quality. Like I was reading something the other day about my car, and like there were like links planted in it, and the keywords were used over and over again, and like clearly this was written for SEO and not for the fact that like I actually want to find out something about my car. Now, Google's AI is attempting to be as good as a human. It's not there yet, but that is what I think you need to do. You need to focus on the human, because expect that Google will eventually catch up and be able to figure out that this content is of quality or not. Now, when it comes to EAT, that's again, like people are trying to improve EAT scores. It's like, make sure that you fake well enough that you are like a real person. So how about skip all the faking stuff and just be a real person, like write honestly, write transparently, like, you know, skip all that, right? So like, I just think it's funny, like I've had clients be like, well, our EAT scores, you know, we were told by another consultant our EAT score is not high enough. We need to put the author's profiles. And like, you have unique content, you've done unique research. Do you really think like, you know, Google's going to decide that, oh, now we're really going to trust it because you put like an author's profile, which could be a stock image, right? Like I would say like it's written honestly, the data's not made up. That's EAT.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Colleen Jones at Content Science, she put out a recent stat. I think it's gone down every quarter that she's done this survey. And I think it might be down to about 55% of people are going through that sniff test. Every time they land on a site, they say they're making the assessment of whether this is hit and miss, whether this is a complete miss, whether this is written by an expert quicker and quicker. So you get kind of one shot of someone looking at that site and saying, oh yeah, this was clearly written by an expert, or this is not, and I do not have this trust. And people are getting more and more, you know, quick to judge when they land on those sites. So I think that there's so many things that just validate what you're saying. And you know, what do you when you get into a situation where you're working with a team that, you know, I love the just be an expert or become an expert or write genuine content or build great processes that yield expert content. What have you seen as far as, you know, low quality practices or old school practices or keyword research practices that just don't lead to differentiation, or finally when they get implemented, the outcome is some of that low quality content that didn't help you with your car anyway?
Yeah, so I think whenever I am in one of these conversations, I always try to have logic overwhelm data.
Yeah.
So in that sense, like I'm approaching a client, and you know, I was in house for a long time and doing the same thing with like my managers or my direct reports. Instead of saying like, hey, let's look at our metric here, let's look at our EAT score, let's look at our rankings metric, let's talk about the logic here. Like when you read this, does this make sense? Like, are you proud of this? Like, scores aside, is this logical? Like, do you really think that you deserve to rank on this? Are you going to sell from this? Is someone really going to click on the CTA? Like, are you tricking people? So that's the one thing when I'm having these conversations. As far as things I've seen in the market, so I've had the opportunity to work with many companies, and you know, I'll come in and say, what are the things you're focused on, and then they'll give me like a download of like an Ahrefs or an SEMrush keyword research. Yeah. And they'll color code it with like, hey, here's all the search volume, and this is what we're focusing on. And like, don't you realize that your competitors also probably have $99? And they can also buy this, and they can also color code it. And you know, Ahrefs and SEMrush are going to get even better, and they're going to color code it for you. So like now you don't have to do the color coding. So like that's where it gets boring, and like no one's really applying that logic layer to it. It's like, well, like I'm selling a product, and like a product I like thinking about, and like, 'cause I have this conversation over and over. It's like, say, insurance. If I'm selling a product like insurance, that's a very easy thing to think about, like what the keyword is on that. And keyword, I'm talking about like 2 words, keyword. And you go into Ahrefs or SEMrush or whatever SEO tool you're using, you put in the word insurance, And what do you know, right? They're going to spit out the top words around it. So it's going to be insurance, it's going to be life insurance, it's going to be health insurance, insurance quote. And then those become the target keywords. Now, no one really takes that logical step backwards and be like, all right, it's the year 2020. The internet's been around, let's say 25 years. So Google has a repository of 25 years of data. The companies that sell insurance like MetLife and Progressive and Geico have had websites since 2000, so that's 20 years. Are you really going to outrank all these websites? And there are not 10 of them, there's 30 of them. Are you going to outrank all these brands on the word insurance? So if you put that logical layer on it, usually the light bulb goes off and be like, oh, what do I do now? Like, this is it. I had my color coded and like insurance was right up there with a million searches and I put it in green. That's what I'm focusing on. That's not really going to fly, right? Like, you need to be a little bit more creative around that and not just do exactly what your competitors are going to do. And the other thing is the way people execute on this. So it's, again, they go on insurance and they got like life insurance, they're selling quotes, and they go on Upwork and they find the high quality writer, not the $5 writer, but the $50 writer. Like, can you give me 1,100 words on the word insurance, and also talk about life insurance, and maybe we're going to be specific and we're going to throw in some geos in there, so it's going to be different than our competitors. Take all those keywords, search them on Google, and you will find that 100 other websites have done the exact same thing.
Yeah, there's nothing better than seeing a competitor who's done a descending sort of a keyword list that you can source from somewhere, because now you know what they're going to do for the next 2 years as well, based on search volume. No, that's really great info. And I guess that when you get the yield on that, when you've worked with teams that have had those outcomes, what does that do internally to create chaos? Like, have you ever experienced that where there's just the fact that they're working with a flawed keyword list and they're not thinking critically about being an expert has just created more silos in the organization?
Oh yeah, I mean, a lot of times I'll come into those situations where they're like, well, SEO hasn't worked. We spent all this money. I was working with a company, a very large brand that had budgets that I was fortunate to get a little bit of, but I would love to have gotten a lot more of. And they're like, well, we signed a 2-year engagement with a content agency, and we gave them $2 million. So $2 million for content for 2 years, and it didn't work. And I look at the content, I'm like, well, of course it didn't work. Yeah. It was never going to rank. And if it did rank, it was so tangentially related to the product. So even if you were number one, you weren't going to sell anything. Like, there's another company I was working with. They built again, I don't know if it was millions, but they spent a lot of money on an outsourced blog that wrote stories. And it was basically whatever their vertical is, it was medium. They recreated like random blog posts that even if they did rank, because I couldn't find any keywords and it was just long form content for the sake of long form content. It was so tangentially related that the best conversion they could get from it is a second page view. Someone would read it and be like, oh, I'd like to read more from this writer, but there was no way that anyone was ever going to convert. So when you come into one of these situations, they immediately start off with like, well, SEO didn't work. I spent $2 million. Look at all these pieces of content. And by the way, like, my thing is I love working with big companies because there's so many disconnects. This company that's $2 million on the content agency, they didn't post 75% of the content because they like couldn't get through all those hoops. So they spent $2 million and they didn't even use it. So, like all those pieces, so that now you're talking to the executive and they're like, well, SEO doesn't really work for us. We spent $2 million. Our engineers are refusing to post things. Our CMS is 2 years behind.
Yes.
Like, that's what it does. You've burned all your actual capital and political capital on a wasted cause.
I mean, burning the political capital with an in-house thing is the biggest flaw, right? The biggest mistake that happens. I love the example because when someone buys content externally, the first thing they do is judge it, right? And if you don't have the feedback loop in that cycle, you're going to end up with a lot of stuff that you don't post, and you're going to feel burned. I mean, you're just going to feel burned, and then you're going to have burned internally. I love the concept of somebody saying maybe SEO doesn't work for us. Right? It's like, yeah, that's definitely it. It's not going to work for you, but it works for everyone else who does it really well. No, that's a perfect example. How do you think about that when you're walking into an organization and maybe the metrics that they're using as their North Star or to guide their historical wins aren't aligned with what you're going to advise? How do you focus on that change management? I mean, with me personally and with the MarketMuse, a lot of times people are making all of their decisions based on search volume. And so we kind of know we need to, get into the story and get into the why you need to be an expert, why you need to own this topic. Let's really change the story there. But what other metrics do you typically see, or is kind of search volume the thing that you're, preaching against from day one?
No, I'm always preaching against search volume. The other thing that I see is when big companies that should know better are they're looking at rankings. Like they're looking at how they rank on some generic keyword, which when I talk to them about it, is impossible to rank. Like you're not going to rank on the word insurance. I've never worked with insurance clients, so no one can try to figure out who it is. But you're just not going to rank on the word insurance. It's not. So like if that is your metric of success, every day you go into work as a failure because you cannot rank on that keyword. And so they're looking at the search volume, they're focusing on this big keyword, and then they're completely unable to rank on it. So one of the things I find is that you do need to build reporting metrics, and sometimes it can be really, really complicated because you have to get into like a multi-touch environment, and like, I may not be the best there, but at least I understand it and can have those conversations. And that is political capital on how to get people to measure what you want. And sometimes you can't do it. And then you have to find other ways to measure yourself and not throw up your hands and say, well, I can't do it, so let's go fall back on rankings or fall back on traffic. Right? Like that company I mentioned that had this huge blog that was totally tangentially related to what they're doing. They got traffic that almost everybody I've ever worked with would be jealous of that traffic, but it didn't do a thing for them. So if you're measuring on traffic and it doesn't drive any revenue, you're not really going anywhere. So ideally, you're measuring yourself on what the business does, whether it's sales or downloads or leads or revenue, even better. Now, sometimes it's kind of impossible because you can't tie all those pieces together, but you should at least try to get like some sort of proxy in that direction. Now, one of the things I find, and this is, I found from my in-house roles, my last role was at SurveyMonkey, where they haven't been there a long time, so I don't know actual data, but they spent millions of dollars per month on paid marketing. They had really, really, really good reporting on how that paid marketing performed. But what they did was, because it worked really well, and Google and Facebook have a huge hand in this, they want to help you get all those conversion pixels so you get the last click. Right. What it does is it undercounts and it discounts all of organic, so paid gets all the credit. And what do you think happens? Oh, we need more signups. Well, let's put more money into paid. So they create this cycle where the bad reporting gets bad budget and keeps going and going. But if you can back into it and say, okay, let's look at the revenue. Let's look at first click. Oh, wow, from a first click standpoint, maybe 2/3 of that revenue comes from organic. Don't you think we should try to tell the story a little bit better? Because if you don't, I'm going to start taking credit for all 2/3 of revenue, and now you can't justify your paid. So that gets you into like almost a political battle where you can find some sort of middle ground where organic matters and SEO matters. So like, that's what I think is really important. Like, find the metrics that the executives care about, and then you get invited to the executive meeting. If all you're doing is measuring on search volume, executives don't care. If you're measuring on rankings, the CEO wakes up in the morning, Googles the word insurance, you're not there, you're still a failure, they don't want to hear from you.
Exactly right. I mean, that is so, I'm so aligned on that. It's like, know who you are, being able to understand and look at your existing content and know where you have opportunities and where you have, lower hanging fruit opportunities, where you have big initiatives that you need to sell internally. Hey, we're not going to get to insurance quotes unless we invest this much money and it's going to take this much time. I mean, that's your leadership capital, or else you've just got a CEO typing in his favorite words in the morning, and then they're saying we're a failure every day, and why should I invest in this? And the idea of indirect value, where you're writing content to exhibit expertise so that you can have a chance to perform well for some of these more difficult terms, or perform well and generate the revenue. But I thought it was relevant because you mentioned, I had just done somebody had asked me, how do I change my leadership's perspective on investing in search and content? And two of the questions that I said was, do they know their value per visit? Do they know it by page type? Do they know it by page? Do they know, are they attributing the KPI that's the same thing they report to their board to content that they create? Or is it all ambiguous? Or do they think PPC is better than, is a better channel? Do they think paid social is a better channel? Do they already have these bias, or have they been burned by a historical project? I mean, you hit on all those things. Those are the questions that need to be asked and to get a project going and to build that capital internally. I thought that was really totally relevant. What do you do when you go into a new project or a new site what's the first thing that you're delivering, or what's the first thing you're talking about? How are you auditing the sites, and how are you, giving them a lay of the land from your perspective, and what makes that special?
So I kind of approach everything differently, because I actually don't believe in SEO audits necessarily, because I have this experience of having worked now most of my career within companies and not necessarily as a consultant outside of companies, and therefore I've received many audits, and they're all useless. No discredit to the people that gave me them. You're all great people, but there wasn't anything I could do with the audit. So I got budget, I got an audit. They were 100 pages. I had an opportunity to present it to my boss in 30 minutes, and then she would say, "All right, so now what?" And I'm like, "I'm not really sure. There's no real takeaway here. It basically said everything's good, but we should make our site faster." So something like that. So I wouldn't start with an audit, because there's no so what. I want to move the needle. So actually the first thing I do with any client is give them information they don't already have, which is, what is their brand versus non-brand split? And I am so amazed that every time I go into one of these engagements, they don't know. So, and they're not really looking at Google Search Console. They're not really looking at any other data. So my source is using Google Search Console, but digging it out via the API. And trying to get some sort of metric on their brand versus non-brand split. Now, when I was at SurveyMonkey and I started at SurveyMonkey, our brand versus non-brand split was in the high 80s. By the time I left, it was about 40% branded, and our brand grew. So like we were able to grow non-brand. Now I've gone into companies where they're like, well, SEO is already killing it, but this is what our CEO wants to focus on next year. You're probably not going to be able to inflect this because we're doing really well. And then I'll go and show them their brand versus non-brand split, and it'll be in the 90s. And I'm like, I beg to differ.
Yeah.
This is not your work. This is all the brand team. You built an amazing brand team, and you're doing a good job because you're not being outranked on your own brand, but there is a lot more out there. So that's the first thing I'll deliver. I just started working with a client, and they're a global client, and their brand versus non-brand split is 99.9%. And I think it's 100. I'm only missing some of the international translations that I'm not able to pick up and filter out. So they're not doing SEO. They have done nothing. And they are a massive brand. When you look at their space, they are the biggest keyword in the space. So that brand is the biggest keyword. So just think about like, well, if they are that biggest keyword, what's everything else they're missing? And that's a lot of potential. The other thing I would say on brand versus non-brand, again, I've had the opportunity to work with some really large brands. I don't want to name drop those, but I will name drop SurveyMonkey, which is a very big brand in surveys. Also the largest query around surveys. So now I've used almost every single keyword research tool out there. At SurveyMonkey, again, I said we spent a couple $1 million a month on paid budgets. When it came to organic, you can't spend a couple $1 million. And when I was able to prove that we drove a lot of value, what I did get was the budget to buy every single tool out there. And Jeff, I believe we did buy MarketMuse, so you got some of that budget. So I had all the keyword tools at the same time. And not a single one of those tools got close to the actual impressions, which is the same as monthly searches, that we got for the keyword SurveyMonkey. So we had probably 4x what any of the best keyword tools would say. So when I work with really large brands that are similar in size to SurveyMonkey and have their biggest keyword is their brand name, what I tell them is stop focusing on all these non-brand terms that you can't do, crush it on brand, right? And I'm not talking like these are big brands, so I'm not talking about just trying to rank on the word brand plus price or brand plus review. It's like really brand plus all those products. So that's the first thing I would do is like really figure out like what is their brand versus non-brand split, and then go ahead and say like here's your biggest opportunity. You're driving so much brand. There's still more brand traffic out there to get because you are the biggest keyword in the space. And then let's start talking about how you could also do non-brand.
No, I think that's really why I've actually seen in a number of cases where it's their brand associated. Maybe they integrate with another vendor, or maybe they also have partnerships, and they're pairing those terms with other things, or they're actually thought leaders in other brands space too, because of their brand's power. So I mean, brand auditing always has to be a part of that initial engagement, because you may not be, I don't know if this happens a lot, you may actually not be putting your brand's best foot forward. You may just rank for it. So what's the experience someone has when they're typing in all those variants of your brand? Is it actually what you want it to be, or are they just landing on your homepage? I know a lot of the times we'll look at that homepage, and that homepage has, it's ranking for 30,000 different words, and a lot of those users are getting there and they're not getting the right page at the right time. And then there's so many easy prioritizable plans when you experience that. I don't know the brand you're thinking about, but I kind of think I do. That would be the exact thing I'd be doing for them, is just think about what is people's experience when they're coming to these kind of hybridized queries. So.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that because they have no non-branded keywords, it's all their brand. So it's just, you just need the brand name.
That's funny. The other thing you had said earlier, and I'm interested in how you'd apply that to kind of internal intelligence or research, and then competitive intelligence, is the situation where maybe they've got some historic content that they're not proud of. I mean, this happens to us all the time, where we start to work with someone and they're like, yeah, that gets about 80% of our traffic. It's out of date, but we're afraid to touch it. Do you ever run into that kind of thing, or just it's a content item that doesn't relate to their brand in one way or shape or another?
Yeah, so those are rough. And actually, I would want to go back to an earlier point I said before on like keywords and keyword search volume. So I think about keywords in split them up in two ways, or two kinds of keywords. One is the keyword you should focus on, and you should try to drive traffic and revenue from it. And the second is a keyword that the CEO is really interested in, even if there's no search volume. So you focus on that, right? And you deliver that to the CEO, and you just say, hey, I've delivered for you. Go bring that to the board meeting. I used to do this at SurveyMonkey. Every time there's a board meeting, the CEO needs to go in and just tell the board. And at SurveyMonkey went public, so like the board actually was more public, and they had to share some of these things in earnings reports, but they had to say things around here. Some keywords are ranking on, and like find those keywords. We know that there's not a lot of search volume for there, but they sound cool, right? And they're really like, they're short terms, and like, let's say it's the word customer satisfaction, and it sounds great. So let's share that. So that's what I'd say is like, you have to recognize when there's like a CEO pet project and when there's actual reality. Now, if you come into an engagement where there's like something that's driving 80% of search traffic and it was the CEO's pet project, you have to kind of level set and say, this is probably not driving revenue. Let's not consider this part of SEO, but you can't kill that, because that's the CEO. You just like made an enemy out of the CEO. You're playing that political game wrong. Now, I do see this all the time where sites are driving a ton of traffic from those kinds of terms. And the reason is because they started with those keyword research lists, and they've started focusing on this content. Like another example I see often is where people create widgets. So like, let's say it's a calculator, whatever space you're in, and let's go back to insurance, like that example, you create like a when will you die calculator. Sounds like that's the kind of thing that people might Google, but is that like really going to lead into a life insurance quote? Or like, what if you don't even sell life insurance? What if you're selling auto insurance? Is there's a disconnect there? So maybe you'll drive a ton of traffic from this seemingly useful widget, but it's not going to drive any leads. It's not going to drive any signups. So I find that all the time. So like, that's where it's like important for you to level set and say like, yeah, I think you get a lot of SEO traffic, but it doesn't drive any meaningful revenue for you. Your conversion rate is abysmal. And when people come to this site, they immediately drop off, right? Like they do the calculator and that's it, right? It doesn't drive any conversions for you. So I just think like sometimes you can't kill those things, but you do have to just sort of put a baseline in there and say like, that's traffic, but it's not really helpful traffic, or know whose it is and don't kill it. If it's like, if that's the person that hired you, definitely don't kill it.
Yeah, you got to ask those questions. You got to kind of get that intuition as if you had worked there for a long time. I love the example of widgets or things that are honeypots as they're referred to sometimes. Are those, what types of data are you throwing off from those honeypots or those calculator type experiences or those maturity model type experiences? And what orgs is it providing value to? And when you try to go through those boxes and it's none of the above, you're kind of in this weird spot. I always, whenever I'm focusing on, I actually did a webinar with with On24 and Netline and a couple other folks recently talking about that explicit case. So we'll link to it in the show notes. Awesome example. As far as competitive analysis, how much of that, when you're talking about building differentiated content and content that is, true and meaningful and is written so that everybody in the business can be proud of it. I mean, that's my goal, right? It's always been. What do you focus on with competitive analysis? And do you do it for the sake of saying, let's be better than them? Or do you do it for the sake of saying, let's be differentiated? Or are you doing it just to kind of scare people into moving faster? I know that's a lot of your mantra is get stuff done, right?
Yeah, I do competitive analysis on every single competitor or every single client I'm working with. And I try to find the competitors that they're looking for, but also the competitors that they're not looking for.
Right.
So that might be like the keywords that they should be ranking on, but are not, and then seeing who is there. So what I'll do there is really show them, first of all, what sort of keywords those competitors are ranking on, just to give an idea of like, are they even the right keywords? So sometimes, again, people are addicted to the SEO tools that just give data. So they'll say like, my competitor has X amount of traffic. But then you show them the keywords and say that, well, like it's all those calculators. They're selling auto insurance, but they got life insurance calculators. Great, that's traffic for the sake of traffic. So I think that's helpful. The number that I really like to show clients is how many pages competitors have indexed, because that gives a sense of like, I just started working with a company, they have about 100 pages indexed and they really want to build SEO, and their competitors all have like 10,000 and they're trying to catch up by writing blog posts. And what I point out is like the velocity of which they need to go to catch up to those competitors requires a decade. So like, that's not the way they're going to catch them. They need to be different. And like, that's my whole thing is I think you need to create different content, but just writing, content towards keywords and hiring those people on Upwork or hiring freelance writers or full-time, they're never going to catch them. So like, that's that big number I like to look at is like, how many pages of index, like what kind of content do they have? And if you're just replicating your competitor, they are way, way ahead of you.
Yeah, no, that's a really important fact. I like to think about competitive cohort analysis where I'm able to build out, and something that we do a lot is we build out basically like their most likely 2021 content plan. This is based on what they've done in the past. This is likely what they're going to do in the future. And that can be really telling, because you could say, oh gosh, maybe I don't invest there. I had a client who had, they were working in two different technology spaces, and they were like, we need to grow 20% in each one of these topics. And we said, okay, well, to build 20% in this topic, you got to build about 180 content items next year, and here they are. In this one, you got to build 1,500. And they were like, whoa, we are not investing that much. So they just leaned into the first one with all their investments. So they're making business decisions that way. I know that that's something that you, based on our discussions, are experienced a lot, where someone doesn't realize how hard it's going to be.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is just like when you're talking about, it's a little bit easier with freelance, in-house is harder, but like if you say you're writing this content, let's say you're spending $50 on content from a freelancer. So just multiply that by the amount of pieces of content you want. If you have an in-house writer, you have to figure out like, okay, how many hours are they actually going to be writing content? You pay them for 40 hours a week. And that gives you your number. And then you might say, well, I need like 30 more of those people in order to like do something meaningful. Now, a lot of times I'll work with companies and I talk about their content budget, and they say, well, we're doing 10 pieces of content a month. We're working really fast. And I'm like, well, multiply that times 12 and you have 120 pieces of content for the entire year. Like, that is not really going to drive the growth you're expecting it to.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's right on the money, especially if they haven't done that. I love the idea. I'm interested in how you classify the competitors. One thing that I've tried to institute is to say, it's not just about the people who you are closing deals against. If you're a vendor to B2B tech or whatever, or you're selling against them directly, you've got publisher competitors, you've got aggregator, you've got adjacent topics where people you're focused on adjacent topics. You've got other kind of temporal content or news content that you wouldn't even necessarily consider. You've got to consider. Do you try to classify and get people to change their stripes about who they consider a competitor?
Yeah, especially if they're getting traffic. So I was working with a company in the HR space this year, and HR's gone through some very interesting, I don't know if they're changes. It's been a bumpy year, right? Because people getting hired and fired and PPP and there's a lot going on for anybody that's just tuning in to 2020. So this company, like, they were producing content for their users around the changing landscape of laws. So right. Whether you could go to work, whether you can't go to work, PPP, the payroll protection loans. Now, they weren't the only ones that are really focusing on that, because the media also does that job. Typically, the media is not in the HR space. In 2020, the media had a lot to say about the HR space. Right. So what I pointed out to them is, like, a lot of the people were really looking for information. They're not really looking for the product they were selling. So they do have to view what the media does as competition. Now, for some of what they did, they really had their ears to the ground. So they picked up some of the legal buzz before the media picked it up. So, like, they were talking to the state houses and reading some of the PDF documents and producing that content, and it drove traffic. But because they were not a news site, they had these spikes of traffic, and then the media tuned in, and then the quick writer looking at Google Trends wrote about something on CNN or Business Insider or any other site that's chasing trends and chasing quick traffic. Doesn't necessarily need to be accurate, but they win that and they take it away from that. Then what happens is that no longer is a news query, and then the news sites like CNN, Business Insider might float off the homepage, or they might float out of the news box, but then this site might come in, but nobody's looking for it anymore. So, like, you do have to, like, really balance that and say, well, are we chasing traffic, or are we helping users? And if we're helping users, we write the content, and the traffic is just gravy, and it's not going to convert for us. If we're chasing traffic, remember, the media is going to notice this, and they're way, way better at this trends thing than we are. Like, they've got the authority, Google trusts them more, like, than anything else. They've earned that trust over many years, and they're going to be visible on it.
You gave me a little chills there. As you know, we're one of the only in-market applications for news research, and the workflow you described is like literally something I focus on with some of our larger publishers. It's situations where you lucked into it, right? You lucked into something that is actually temporal or driving, some degree of traffic bump from a current event of some sort, and you're not going to have that forever. The publishers are too good. They're too good for you to maintain that. And that's an interesting way that you framed that. I thought that was really poignant. If someone's relying on traffic, the other thing you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to go back to it because of something you just said, is how inaccurate do you typically see the solutions you're using versus when you actually see the real analytics? From a traffic perspective, like, we see it's based on the authority of the site on various topics. They'll be getting major multipliers of what some of the other tools are saying that they're getting, and they're making decisions based on one set of data, but they're running their business based on their analytics. Is that something you commonly run into?
Always, yeah. I mean, I don't want to call out the specific investor, but let's say there's an investor, a large private equity investor with billions and billions of dollars at their disposal that's invested in some of the biggest companies that we all use on a daily basis. So I was working with a company that investor is one of their investors, and the VP of growth that I was working with received an email from this investor telling them that they had missed on something very important for the pandemic, because Ahrefs was showing that their competitors were crushing it and they were not. And they asked me for help framing a response. And the response we framed is that the data was wrong because we were crushing it. And I mean, I don't know what the competitors were doing, but whatever this investor thought was not happening for us was actually happening for us. So that's what I would say about this data is, like, in absence of other data, if you don't know how much traffic your competitors are getting, like SimilarWeb, Ahrefs, SEMrush, like, all these things are helpful, but they are just estimating. When it comes to, like, how you're actually performing, I would only trust your own eyes. So if you're Googling it and you see it, or Google Search Console, because that's your data. What I don't trust, and this is an internal tool, is Google Analytics. So I learned, the most about data from Google Analytics. Like, the startup I worked at and really learned about SEO I was learning everything Google Analytics, Search Console, called then they call Webmaster something. Webmaster Tools, right? It was pretty useless. I mean, it was good for writing a reconsideration request and telling you, all your internal links. It's something. It wasn't that helpful. But
Yeah.
we use Google Analytics, and when we got hit by Google penalties, like that was the single source of data. But what happened in the last even 10 years is there's been this like all-out war on tracking data, and like from iPhones and from all sorts of mobile browsers and governments, and Google Analytics has become massively inaccurate. So much so that like I was just working with this company, and I was trying to understand the revenue data, and we're looking at analytics, and I said, oh, is this revenue data accurate? And they're like, no, not in the least bit. I'm like, so why is it even here? And then he's like, well, how do we reconcile this traffic? And I'm like, your traffic, the traffic number you're showing right now for total search is 4x the amount that we actually get. So we're quadruple counting. And then we looked at some other data, and it was like undercounting. So like it was completely inaccurate. So I'd say like it has become very, very difficult to use Google Analytics and to really trust the data there. And like so many times I'll go into situations where like I'm partnering with a client, and they say, okay, here's our analytics data, and then I ask them a question, and they're like, well, don't really trust it because there's an issue with it. So then why are you using it? And the saddest thing is that marketing teams, if they're not talking to the data science team, that's really all they have. So they're using a tool that they know to be completely inaccurate, both on a traffic standpoint and on a revenue standpoint, and that's all they've got. And it could go either way. It could be massively undercounting or massively overcounting. It's not like you can say like, all right, it's the day after election here, so we got to make fun of the polls. It's not like you could say, well, it undercounted, so let's just add 10% to it. You really got to say like, I mean, it could go anywhere. So this data is completely useless. Like if you're doing like a month-over-month analysis, like last month, the rules could have changed, and like you can't even say that this month it's overcounting, last month is overcounting. It really could have been either way.
No, you're on the money. I mean, I always like to ask, and I'm interested in your take on this one. A couple of questions is, look at your direct none in analytics, and can you describe where all that traffic comes from? And I mean, and then also when you are looking at your search volume, the target keywords or target topics on a page, compare that to the actual traffic. If you've achieved a ranking, how off were you? So if you're basing these decisions based on search volume, and let's say it says 10,000, and you're like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to be able to get 3,000, 4,000 from a top ranking. You get it. Then that page got 18,000. How predictive truly was using that metric? I mean, we see that all the time. It's the pool multiplier of all the different types of queries that you're ranking for. It makes the use of those things to be extremely just directional. It's not going to be something you can predict on the knife edge. You're going to have to be just basically getting directional insights from solutions like you see here. I'm interested in what you're using in your workflows today. And how do you preach, or how do you give advice for someone? Hey, take this stuff directionally. Don't set your watch to it because it's not accurate. Use some examples. What do you do now when you're trying to advise on these types of kind of stack development or stack building?
Yeah, so my favorite tool is what you got there right up in the top right, so Answer the Public. So I really like live data that comes from Google. So whether that's me searching myself and then pulling out all the related queries at the bottom, anybody that's ever tried to fake a related query, it's been many years since I've tried to fake a related query. The way it used to be able to fake a related query is you pay people on Mechanical Turk to like run queries for you. You can't do that anymore. So if a related query is on Google, like related meaning at the bottom it says the actual related query, or it shows other questions people were asking, or it's a Google suggest coming Answer the Public, it's real. That means thousands of people, who knows how many, but enough that scientific database is doing it, right? Like a large amount of people are searching those terms. That is real. So base that on real data. You don't really need those assumptions on how many people are. Just assume it's a lot of real people. So I've worked with clients where like I'll look in their search console and I'll see they're ranking on keywords that they have not used on their page. Yes. And they're ranking on keywords that are not in any keyword research tool, but they're getting thousands of clicks a month. So am I going to say, well, I've got to disregard this because the keyword research tools, they say nothing. They say, well, we recognize the keyword, but it's no data. You've got to trust that what you see, which is people do search that term. Another thing I would say is like, when you're using tools like Answer the Public, they're catching things quickly. So like, I don't know how many people listening to this and watching this today, like how many of you tried to focus on keywords around COVID and waited for all the tools to catch up, knowing that like it's changing on a day-to-day basis. Like if you looked up coronavirus, like there was nothing there in most of the tools for a really long time. But if you went to answer the public, it was there that day, right? Like people were searching it. You look at Google Trends, and there's some like amazing trends. It's like the media called it coronavirus. People search coronavirus, then they call it COVID-19. People search that. Like that's happening in real time. You need to be, if you're creating content, you need to be on the real time, not waiting for a keyword research tool to catch up and then normalize it based on trends.
Oh yeah, right on. I mean, that's why we built our question solution is very tuned on that. It's very focused on building out. We build our own topic models out to say like, how would someone cover this topic comprehensively if they were going to cover it? And then we'll also try to figure out what intents are trending in that data set. So I mean, right on the money, why you would want to do that. Are you really going to wait 2 months to get that information? And where's it coming from? Really, is it coming from click tracing? Is it coming from, toolbars? Where is that data information, and can you rely on that? Is it connected to your analytics or the part of your analytics that you trust? I think that's all really important to write content that's special. What do you do in a situation where you have a content item ranking for, we call it an intent mismatch? It's ranking maybe for that question, but it's not answering that question. Are you giving advice to people to expand that content or write new content that does appeal to that intent?
Yes, I would have them adjust it. Because if you already have that visibility, then meet the need of that visibility and try to maximize on it. The mistake I think people make is they say, well, I've already created that piece of content. Let's create another piece of content. And now you're going to war with yourself. Like that doesn't make any sense. Like if you've already got a piece of content there, and I'll do this not just on questions. I'll do this like, you'll do a site colon search, not necessarily accurate, but gives you an idea in a site. Like you take your client name, let's say it's, .com, do a site colon.com, and you're like, well, I'm searching this keyword, and here's the piece of content coming up before the piece of content I want to come up. That may be indicative that Google likes that piece of content better or not, right? It's hard to know. You could also use Google Search Console and see which one's getting more visibility on the impression. Marry that. Don't fight against it. So just embrace it and say, well, this is the piece of content that's going to win. Put the calls to action there. Specifically on calls to action. You can have another mismatch, like your content might match the intent, but what if you have the wrong call to action? You're trying to sell something when really the best you could do is maybe get someone to subscribe to an email or like you on social or something like that. Like embrace it, don't fight it. Like if that's what people want to do, go with it.
Yeah, I love the advice of making sure it makes sense to the narrative you've created. Expand the page to cover that intent if it makes sense. If it doesn't, maybe you do need to create a separate item, but make sure that it actually tells the story you want to tell. The collection of content that you have on your site needs to make sense when they land there. It's easy to find the answer to that question or the value that you offered. I mean, basically when you're in that search result, you're offering somebody, you're saying, hey, I'm the dream page that answers your specific intent. And then when they land there, if it's not following through, maybe you do have to adjust, maybe you do have to build something new. Really, how do you make those decisions about when to create and when to update? Awesome conversation, Eli. These are like the both combination growth hacking, how to get things done within your organization, also keyword research, topic research, prioritization of projects. So this has been really, really valuable. Lots of questions have come in. I'll save the ones about the election till the end of this list, and I'm kind of giving y'all an eye roll. I'm glad I have upgraded camera so you can actually see me eye roll, but we'll answer them because I always say we answer all of them. But the first question I have is when you are prioritizing projects for large businesses and the project may take a very long time, how do you maintain that prioritization? Because Google may have changed is basically that's the narrative of the question that came in. If something's going to take a year, how do you keep how do you keep that as a top priority if you know it's going to take a really long time when maybe things might have changed in that time frame?
There's two ways to answer that. Yeah, I like that question. There's two ways to answer that question. One is I would say usually Google doesn't change, so like you'll be okay, and you should keep shipping that product if you believe that whatever you're doing. And it sounds like if something's taking a year, it's more than an article. If it's taking a year to do an article, I mean, there's a lot of ways you could fix that. But if you're building something and you believe it's the right thing and it takes a year, I wouldn't be too worried about Google changing. That being said, that did happen to me once, which is I was at SurveyMonkey and we decided to go pursue a TLD strategy for international. So TLDs are .co.uk, .com. So we decided to pursue a TLD strategy. We had a unique advantage in that Google was a very large investor in SurveyMonkey, and we were able to get some better insight than most people would get that it might be advisable. All the people that gave that advice are no longer at Google anymore. So so we decided to pursue this. Now, for a company like SurveyMonkey, which was really large and had a lot of aspects to how people log in and all that, and cookies and use the product. It's not as simple as like, well, we'll just replicate this site and here's surveymonkey.co.uk. And so we decided to pursue that strategy. A lot of changes happened in the time that we were working on the strategy, and it took about a year and a half to 2 years to finally launch. By the time that happened, I think Google did change. We moved to a world where search became a lot more mobile first, and this has been a few years ago. Search became a lot more mobile first, and for anybody that uses a mobile phone, I hope everyone does, you'll notice that the domains aren't visible on mobile search. So domains don't matter anymore. And the reason we're building this TLD strategy is because a British user is more likely to have some sort of affinity to surveymonkey.co.uk than .com. And the domain stopped being visible, and it actually, I don't believe that it was ever necessary at that point to have a TLD. So we put all this effort in, we did the .co.uk, and it ended up hurting us. We got less traffic because we did create that conflict in the canonicals and redirects and all that. And we did not receive the upside of users are going to like it better, Google's going to like it better, because I think they stopped liking it better. We rolled out one more, it was quite disastrous, and we never went back. So I'd say like most of the time, the world does not change like that. I don't think I could have at the time foreseen that it would change, because I would have never have seen that coming. I also didn't know the project was going to take a year and a half to 2 years. But I'd say like most of the time, that thing won't happen. In this case, everyone can go right now. There's surveymonkey.co.uk, still exists. Surveymonkey.de still exists. Nothing else exists. Like, we stopped that project. So most of the time, I think you'll be fine.
Yeah, I think the great advice to just are you doing the right thing? Are you doing, if something's going to take a long time and it's a bit of a trick or a parlor game, I think that's something that you shouldn't invest in, because that may be something that catches up with you. But if you're doing things that make sense logically or from a business perspective, I think it's a great idea. I love that question. Thanks, Don. All right, great question, Adrian. Biggest mistakes you see publishers make, and what are your best tips for them? Publishers, as in publishing companies, not SaaS product companies that think they're publishers. By the way, that's hilarious. All right, what do you got there?
Wait, so publishers as in like book publishers or media publishers?
I'm going to guess they mean publishers like people that publish lots of content and their main revenue source is advertising or membership management or lead gen. So, yeah. So
I think probably the biggest mistake that publishers make is they don't do an effective job at really creating an internal link architecture around the content they're going to create. So I'd say when you have a SaaS product and I like that question, you're a fake publisher, you do a really good job because you're cross-linking, because you want to make sure you're continuously selling. When you're a publisher, you don't necessarily do the same thing, because you write content and then you forget to link to old content because it's no longer relevant. So that would be one I would say, and that can be addressed by having widgets that create, and those should be server-side widgets, not client-side widgets, but there should be widgets that just link to old content. Granted, it does look stupid to users, so you have to figure out a balance. It's like, I know, like if I'm looking at a media site and I'm reading an article about something today and it references something related that happened 4 years ago in the news, that's right, like not the greatest experience. So you want to figure out how to balance that. And the truth is, like, that old piece of content maybe should not be getting traffic. But if you're a publisher and you're creating content that's maybe not as newsworthy, then it's relevant to have those sort of widgets. So I'd say that's the biggest mistake, is thinking too much about content and not enough about technical.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's my answer too. It's linking. I mean, we have a solution in MarketMuse Connect. It gives you advice on internal and external links, but linking after the fact you publish and then you link back. So some people have gotten religion on that, and they'll link back to old content when they publish new. They won't go back to the existing content and point to their new, their old stuff. And then I think the other one is really, do you have a update cadence or an update triggers baked into all the content that you write? So update this when this happens, update this at least quarterly, having that update cadence and going back and making sure that you're putting your business's best foot forward. I mean, that is the miss. I mean, typically updates are managed out of a spreadsheet, and they hope to get to a few of them every month, every week, whatever the number is. So yeah, great question, love it. And when you're in a SaaS product, just like you said, you're more likely to be thinking critically about your entire inventory, and you're not likely to be thinking of your site as a newspaper. Not saying that that's a bad thing, but yeah. Great question. All right, you mentioned brand. Anita asks, you mentioned good brand or brand non-brand split. Is there a good brand non-brand split?
It really depends on the brand you have and the vertical you're in. So I'd say, like, again, when I joined SurveyMonkey, they were at 80%, and then I was able to bring that down to the 40s. I'd say 40s is a healthy space. Now, if you're a relatively unknown brand, 10 to 90 might be the best you'll be, because you're not gonna be Ketchup, you're not gonna be P&G, you're not gonna be Kraft.
Yep.
Now, if you are a very well-known brand, it could be that the best you'll get to in your brand services that entire vertical, the best you'll get to is 70-30. So it's really a process of evaluation of, like, how much of your traffic is branded versus non-branded, and can it be better? And I'd say it's somewhat individual. 50, it might be like 50-50 might be something you can target. Again, totally depends on the brand and the vertical.
Totally depends on the brand. And it's also what I like to always think, if someone is really heavy brand, what if they weren't allowed to use their brand? What content would they create? And that's something that I always go through a thought exercise if someone's really heavy brand. So I think that's a great question. But there's no, in certain spaces and regulated spaces, this is a very important topic because sometimes they're not allowed to mix non-branded with branded. But as far as, pharmaceuticals, life sciences, but in every other space, it's going to be the case where you're really trying to get what you can get. Do you have any non-branded traffic coming to pages that are heavy brand, and it actually should be earlier in the funnel or early decision or consideration? And I think that content mapping and understanding your existing traffic patterns is part of that process. I love that question. Yeah. All right, Josh. So Josh Spilker, I know he'll be happy I said his name because he's one of my favorite people in search. What do you do when you're very far behind your competitor? What do you do when you're very far behind your competitor with content? Like you mentioned with that 100 versus 10,000 example.
All right, so now is when I get to plug my book.
Yes.
So I'm writing a book that's coming out in early January, February. It was going to come out last year or this year, but we had a pandemic. So my book is product-led SEO. That's my approach to the way I like to build SEO in larger companies. And I don't really think it's about catching your competitor. I think it's about building something related to your product, like a content offering that is relevant to your vertical and relevant to converting users. Now, when you're doing that, I love to find something that's programmatic and scalable. Sometimes you can't. And by programmatic and scalable, I'm meaning taking structured data and building pages. So like an example would be Zillow. So Zillow does not write on a page for every single address in America. It is programmatically built, and it is scalable because it can scale. I'm sure they started in a small city, and it can scale to every single address in America, and then they could do it to commercial addresses, and then they could go to other countries. It continuously scales without, like, as we were talking earlier, the need to like pay another Upwork writer $50 to write this content. So I love thinking about, like, what is the product, what is the value offering you can do for a user, and then trying to build something programmatic. Another example of programmatic, not necessarily the same as structured data, is creating a Q&A library. So whatever vertical you're in, can you get some sort of velocity of users asking questions and users answering questions? Again, that is scalable and it is programmatic because you don't need to go in and write individual pages. So don't view your competitors, while they have 18,000 pieces of content, it's going to take me 30 years to catch up. Meanwhile, they're continuously writing content, so you'll never catch up. But think about, what is it that you could offer in your space that no one else is offering? And one tip I would offer for that is to go on to Quora and go on to Reddit and look at the questions that people are asking and trying to find the themes that no one else seems to be answering. And there you may find some product ideas.
I love it. Oh man, I'm doing it right now. We have something that's going to likely come out next year that's our own version of that, but I've done that my entire career. I've done product-led. That's always been my product-led SEO concept. And you're writing a book about it, which, guys, get this book. It's going to be amazing. All right, I got two more. You have time for two more questions? Two more quick ones?
Sure do.
All right, one more.
Yep.
How do you decide what topics to focus on when someone is wait a second, what is the best practice to decide what topics to focus on in addition to just writing about your product? I think I got that right, Wilson.
All right, so now we get down to prioritization on using the right metric. So the number one metric you should be using is performance for the business. So whatever your KPI is. So if you have to decide between two pieces of content, one has 10,000 searches per month, and you may rank, you may not rank. Let's assume you'll rank number one on both. Another one has 100 searches per month, but your conversion rate on that piece of content might be 50%. So take whatever click-through rate you're going to get from having only 100 searches per month. Take whatever click-through rate you're going to get from having 10,000 searches per month. Multiply, then you have your actual visit number. Multiply that by your expected conversion rate. That's how you prioritize. So prioritize where you're going to make the most money. Now, this could get complicated if you add in something like order value. What if on the higher searched item, the order value might be higher, the lower searched item, the order value might be lower? Add that math in, but that is how you should prioritize. What will provide the most impact to the business? Now,
Absolutely.
I don't know where you're sitting when you're asking this question, whether you're a consultant or whether you're in-house. If you only have one shot to make, I would make that shot, because if you're successful, you actually get more shots, right? You made more money for the business, you get to try again. If you're unsuccessful, you failed at that shot and you don't get to make more shots.
Right on. I mean, that is straightforward as it gets. If you have existing cohort to compare with, if you don't and you're net new, try to use competitive. I mean, that's a brilliant question. All right, last question. This is the one I roll my eyes on. From Jean-Paul. Can SEO help us guess who the next president will be? I'm gonna just say no. How about you, Eli?
Everyone tried to use all sorts of data, but it really came down to individual people. So,
it's all about the people. Yeah, it's all about the people.
Search is all about people too. So that's I say the message we can take from this is it's all about marketing. It's all about putting the best foot forward, but it really comes down to each individual voting, which is the same as you can make all the assumptions you want on, like, this is how many searches per month I'm going to get. This is how many people are going to click that. And this is what my conversion rate is going to be. But if you have not appealed to that user, your model will not hold. So build for the user, appeal to the user, and you will sell.
All right, that's perfect, full circle. Go check out MarketMuse, Optimize Plus Pro. We've got some promos. You see a code here. It's a special one, just came out today. Go check out. Eli is on LinkedIn, Twitter. His LinkedIn's extremely active, and it's so interesting. Every day I am on it, and I know it's just been such a pleasure today. But thank you for joining us. Please download this recording, like I mentioned. Eli, thanks for spending a little bit of extra time with us today, and I think that this conversation is going to be one that a lot of people download. Thanks again.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Jeff.
Yes.